the middle of winter and we're all sitting around thinking about our next gardens, and I bet we're all dreaming of bigger, more beautiful gardens. But I think the question here is really, do you need to have a bigger garden? And does that mean you're really going to produce more food for your family? Here's the current state of my garden, still covered up. Looks like the cold is going to just persist. And this is what we've got for our garden so far. And you know, we've talked about expanding many times in the past. We've got plenty of space. I mean, if I just keep in line with that, I can probably fit 5 or 6 more beds comfortably up to, you know, within a decent distance of my fire pit here. But we go back and forth about it a lot, and I've ultimately decided that I don't really want to expand too much more. It's been my goal to slowly expand until I find the point in which we're happy with what we're producing from our garden. There's a lot of ways to approach this, and one of them is definitely, you know, eating fresh out of your garden and using stuff appropriately. But then once you start adding preserving into the mix, things get a little bit different, and it starts to really ramp up in what you can do in your garden and the amount that you can plant. And on the flip side, what it does is it means you can now enjoy the bounty of your harvest from your garden throughout the entire year into the next year. So there's a lot to this. And I know I've been talking a lot about this lately, about the size of the gardens and stuff, but is really what this comes down to is like the way we plant. That's what it's really all about. So we're going to focus on what a really big garden is and really the downfalls of it. Now, what's considered a big or a small garden is really subjective, really and truly is. But for me, the perfect size garden really, as of right now, has been, for management wise, been these 4 beds and then this bed over here. That's been really the perfect setup for me. And the greenhouse doesn't really count because this is like a total winter project. So, you know, during the regular season, that's kind of off limits. So we're not going to worry about that. The big question, or the big thing here, is when we start expanding our gardens, it really comes down to what you're comfortable taking care of and what you can take care of appropriately. So here's the point in the video where I try to get it in before everybody, you know, before people start cutting it off, but I want you to hear this. A small, well-managed garden is much more productive and peaceful than a large, piss-poor managed garden, right? So if you have a small garden and you can stay on top of it and you get the weeds out of it and the pests under control and you're harvesting crops, great. But as you get a bigger garden, if you can't keep up with it, it's no good. It's no good. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, because then what you're going to do is you're going to walk out and you're going to be like, this bed sucks, that bed sucks, let me work on this. So it's all about finding that space. And then in today's world where we're in for instant gratifications and maximum, you know, reward, it's tough to take a slow approach to this and really build out over time. I mean, think about it. What's the rush? Like, why is it that when we get into it, and look, I'm not calling anybody out. I'm just as guilty as the rest of us. This is my 3rd garden at the 3rd property, and it took me 3 gardens to get used to it. So trust me. But what's the rush? There's no gardening Olympics. You're not going to win an award, you know. If you let your food go to rot, you're not using it, you're wasting your time, resources, money, effort, everything. And so we look at it and we say, hey, we need to have the biggest and largest garden possible. But if we go back to the previous couple videos and we think about it in a well-managed space, I mean, we've already covered that what these 6 beds can produce, can really produce all the food that you need. I mean, I will be the first to admit that would be a tight fit, but it's, I mean, I've done it. It's completely possible. I just did it last year, you know, so it's completely possible to manage it. But adding on to a garden, there are benefits to it. So I know if you're new to the channel, you're seeing these beds that aren't filled up yet. They're technically not new, they're moved, but they will be, it's almost going to be like and expansion because they're going to be more productive where they are. So we're kind of, in a sense, I'm looking forward to that, and then in a sense, I'm kind of not. So the reason why is because it's more work. You know, last year I got a little bit spoiled because when these beds were over there and I knew they were failing, I just let them stop and just focused over here, and it was really nice. So we're anxious to see what's going to come out of this year and how this is going to work. But we're going to work to it. We're going to work through it, and it'll happen. Everything is going to be just fine. But the benefit of this is we had a year with it, all of these beds put up, right? So now when we add this in, we're kind of doing the same thing, but also I'm designing it a little bit different so that even though we're adding a bunch in, like for instance, these two, I don't know if you can see, the two front beds, the two 3x6 beds, they're going to be sweet potatoes. So what that means is I'm going to plant them, but I plant them in May, and then I basically don't do anything to them until September. So it kind of is the same as, like, it's not really adding too much more space because at that point I'm only managing 2 extra beds instead, because for me sweet potatoes basically run their course. I put them in the ground, I give them a dose of fertilizer, and they run and they grow, and then I harvest, and then we replant if we want. Another benefit of this larger garden is simply we can now factor in beds to rest for a season much easier. So remember, we said we needed roughly 4 to 6 beds to produce the food that we need, and which that's what we have here. So here we have beds that we can now work into rotation and start letting beds rest over a season. So you can see here, this bed's not really resting, but it's kind of, I mean, nothing is going to be harvested out of it. And more than likely what I'm going to do is I'm just going to chop all this up and put it right back into the soil as long as there's no disease on it. So this is kind of resting, but what I'd ultimately like to do is leave 2 of these beds blank next winter. So we would leave, for, let's just call it easy, this bed and the next bed. Leave them totally empty, and then we can factor that into the process, and then come over here, fill these beds up, and then even still, if we felt like we needed more room, we could plant in these beds right here, you know? So it's not really gonna make that much of a difference, but it helps us to let beds rest, to recharge them, revitalize them, stuff like that. If you're anything like me, I can be indecisive sometimes, believe it or not. It kind of, I'll get an idea about something, but then it takes me a little while to pull the trigger. So setting up slowly but surely and expanding over time lets you really sit there and marinate on it and say, hey, let's do this. But more importantly than looking at it saying, is this going to take up my space that I want? You know, it's thinking, what am I going to do in those beds? What is the goal for them? And your goal shouldn't be I'm gonna grow as much food as possible. That's not it. It's what am I gonna plant in those beds? What's gonna go well in those areas? What's gonna help happen if we have more sun and we're gonna get more sun? What can we grow? What if we get less sun? How can we grow in that? What can we do with them? And actually having a plan going into it, it really helps you to stay focused in your journey for your garden and not overextend yourself, really. The other thing is just sheer cost behind it. I mean, clearly, you need materials, which by the way, we did line our beds with cardboard just because I had a lot of cardboard left over from Christmas. So it's going to kind of help out, but we got to put soil in it. You got to build irrigation of some sort, whatever you want to do, fertilize plants, all that stuff. And then also comes to the time of year we have to plan for our seed starting to go into these plants and these beds. So by us putting in 4 more beds, we now need to increase what we can do, which means if you can't do it on your current seed starting area, then you're going to have to expand that. So it's like a trickle effect. It just keeps going and going and going and expanding until you find what you need. So I know I said in the beginning, like, this is my perfect size garden without these 4 beds. And even before, so at some point before everything started growing back over here, we were getting pretty good production, and I was really happy with what was coming out of my space. It was giving me a little bit extra. We had a little bit of leeway. We were able to kind of incorporate beds. More importantly, you know, when our potatoes came up, we could go back and put a cover crop in instead of really feeling pressured to replant right away. And that's something that we wanted to do. So having that option is really, really nice. And knowing that we're growing through not like 3.5 seasons. So right now is winter time. We're not even a month into winter, and we're going to be harvesting our beds out pretty soon and emptying them out. Truthfully, I'm just waiting for this cold snap, which appears to be extended by a little bit. Hell, we might get snow. Now in coastal North Carolina, if we get snow, it's like Armageddon here. It's crazy. We're just not prepared for it. So I'm hoping that doesn't happen, but you know, whatever, it is what it is. But once that passes, we will be taking the covers off and we will be going through them and starting to remove plants and empty out beds and really let them have their roughly about a month of rest before we can go in. And not all of them are going to be emptied, but they're going to be starting that process. So we're definitely going to be emptying this bed, and then we're definitely going to be emptying this bed over here, and probably this bed and that bed. We're probably going to be emptying them out in fairly rapid succession. We already started harvesting our broccoli out of this bed. I came out as like 20 degrees the other night and cut some broccoli for dinner. So it was really nice to have that option. Benefit of the garden. I can't stress to you enough, I don't want people to get overly excited and just expand out as far as they can go. I think it's really important to take a measured approach to it and take your time, because there's a certain reason. I'm going to give you my reason. So this is what slowed me dead in my tracks. So before we even added these 2 beds up here, we had the wild garden over there, and it was doing pretty good at the time. And we had these 5 beds back here and the greenhouse. And I sat down to do a not a seed starting chart, which if you want one, they're available, just email me. I made a garden plan, and I was going through, I made a list, and this is when I was really starting to get organized, like trying to be pretty methodical in my planning and executing a plan that I had created. So I sat down and I wrote a list of crops that I wanted to grow, and then I made a list next to it of square footage that they could go in. And then I made a sketch of my gardens, and now I don't do sketches anymore. I use the Planter app, which if you listen to Backyard Gardens podcast, there's a link below, get you a discount on it. I love it, it's great. But I made this out, and as I went through and I started making my plan, I ended up having like a bed left over, and I legit was sitting there and I was like, I don't know what else to plant. I had everything figured out about how much I wanted to plant, how I was gonna use it, what my anticipations were, and then when it came down to it, I didn't know what else to put into the garden bed. So I ended up doing a bunch of fillers, and lo and behold, don't you know that we started to not really throw, but we were giving away vegetables, and we were letting beds kind of fail to an extent. We were letting certain crops go. We weren't trying as hard because I wasn't fully prepared at that time for it. So fast forward 2 years. In 2 years, that garden started to kind of wind down. I could see the writing on the wall. So last year we added these 2 beds in, but we had a plan. And one thing I've been focusing on lately is really focusing on shelf-stable, long storage crops, meaning broccoli, potatoes, sweet potatoes, different squashes that are like winter squashes, stuff like that. Stuff that you don't really have to process. Stuff that if you take it and you stick it in the refrigerator, it'll last a month. Stuff that just is basically, I don't have to process. I don't know any other way to say it. And it really did help, because what that did is that freed me up. So last year was the big time where it really freed me up. I had a lot of produce available to us that we were able to enjoy. And I didn't really even can anything last year. That's why you didn't see me talk about it on the channel or even on the podcast, because I just wasn't canning much last year. I did miss doing that, and now we had to go through some of our stores, so we're about out of our canned goods, which is good. So I think we got like 2 cans of carrots left. They're like 2 years old now. and we've got a couple cans of tomatoes left. So we're winding down on what we have. And so now that we have the shelf stable crops, long storage crops really under control, now we can expand into other crops. So one thing I'm going to do this year, we grew a whole bed of potatoes, and then we grew a bed of potatoes over here, but it just really didn't do that good. I think we got maybe 10 pounds out of it versus like the 30 or 40 out of here. So we're actually going to do 2 beds this year, I think is the plan. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn around and I'm going to can a bunch of them right up front, because we didn't can any potatoes last year, and I ended up not using all of my potatoes. They went bad. So we just go to the drawing board. How can we fix that? How is that problem? Because that's what a bigger garden gives me now, is it gives me the option to do certain things. So if I didn't feel like I could manage this garden here, I wouldn't do it. But I feel like I can, with my methods, I can manage it, I can harvest it, I can can it or preserve it if need be. And then the other side of it is, if I don't want to do that, what am I going to do with the beds if I'm not using them? Quite simply, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cover crop it. So if I feel like at any point throughout the year that I just can't manage this bed, just this bed right in front of me, and I'm struggling and I'm working all the time and I'm not having any fun in my regular life, then this bed would be cover cropped. I'm just using this as an example. And then that would just, so it's working while we sleep. It's important, you want it to work for you, right? So if we cover crop it, then we can use that to our advantage, but we're still growing out of the other one. So that way we can lower the numbers of what we have to take care of physically. But in all reality, we're already doing something to take care of it. So it kind of works out, but be careful. Be careful on what you wish for a bigger garden. And I know some of you have really big gardens and you manage them very well, and my hat's off to you. But this is the size that I feel like I can manage. And I don't really, unless something bad happens in the world, I don't see myself expanding out any further than you see behind me. And then I definitely am not expanding any further that way because there's no room. So I don't expect to do that. I don't plan on doing it. You never know what the future entails, but my goal is to get this garden and these new additions up and running and getting them to go into the right direction. So once they get running, they get smooth, I figure out, hey, we can do this, we can do that. Then we can say, hey, let's add on. Let's make an adjustment. But doing something as simple, absolutely as simple as removing a trellis from a bed like I did on this bed here, where we had the mosaic virus, now changes my entire garden plan completely. Because now that opens up to a whole new world of crops that I can plant there versus what it was before, where it was really limited to what goes on a trellis. So there's all kinds of ways to look at this. And on the converse, adding a trellis can really narrow it down and give you a place to grow said vegetable that you need the space to grow it.
Goodbye.